Welcome to Your Bird Story, a podcast about everyday people and their relationships and interactions with wild birds. I'm your host, Georgia Silvera Seamans. Hi, welcome listeners back to Your Bird Story. I'm here with Emily Williams, who is a former guest and spoke to us about the American robin. And let me get the date for you. We published that episode on September 8th of 2022. At that time, Emily was working on her doctoral research about the American robin, asking some really interesting questions and studying robins in Washington, D.C. I asked her back because I came across a news article by WBEZ Chicago about declines in American robins, in particular in cities. Emily, would you mind introducing yourself and just giving a summary of your dissertation before we dive into recent news?
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for having me. And I'm Emily Williams, and I am still working on that dissertation research, but I am in the home stretch. So it should be done in a couple months. And my dissertation research on American robins, kind of the big question is, what are the patterns of their migration and what shapes variation in their migration? And so far I've put out 2 chapters of my dissertation. They're in the world and currently going through review. So they have been submitted to different scientific journals, and the one chapter basically describes and tries to explain the movements that robins do during the wintertime. And so this is when robins have either migrated or not migrated, and looks at, how far do they go, general pattern of their movement, and whether that's influenced by things like temperature and snowfall and landscape context. So, how urbanized are the areas in which they're using? And then the other chapter is obviously in bias. I think all of this is really cool, but this other chapter I think is probably the coolest of my dissertation research, and it is looking at behavioral flexibility. So that is looking at the same individual robins and seeing, do they do the same thing year after year, or can they change up what they do? And as it turns out, probably people can guess if they remember what I said in the last podcast episode. Basically, robins are incredibly flexible, and we show that there are robins that can migrate in some years and don't migrate in others. And then in terms of the timing in which they migrate, where they go, so individuals that may migrate every year also go to different locations for the winter year to year. So kind of all across the board, they are really flexible and do something different. So the last chapter, which is the one I'm working on now, is migratory connectivity paper. And so that is looking at, do the robins that spend their summers together also winter together? And probably guess that the answer is no. For example, robins in the DC area, if they do migrate, we had individuals that went to Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina. So clearly the birds that are within a 5-mile radius of each other in summer go to vastly different places during the winter. And this paper is going to combine pretty much all the data that we have on robins. So this is going to be all the tracking data. So not just the tracking data that I have collected for my dissertation, but I've also reached out to other researchers who have also been putting GPS tags on robins, and they have been willing to share their data. So we're going to compile all that data along with long-term banding data of robins, which that is effectively if you have the same individual that's been captured in summer and then recaptured in a wintering location. So you can again kind of connect summer to winter there. So we're combining all the banding data and the tracking data to kind of give a continental perspective of how connected these robin populations are in the summer to where they spend their winter.
Is it a matter of individual choice? Why are these let's summer together robins going to different places in the winter?
I'll give the like typical scientist answer, which is like we can't really measure choice in animals, but I think it varies. So my data show this, and I don't think there's really any other data that really explicitly shows this, but there is kind of a latitudinal gradient in, how flexible robins are. So, the robins that are spending their summers in Alaska and northern Canada likely choice. I do still think individuals make choices in terms of like based on prevailing conditions in September, are they going to start their migration this day or the next day? There's some amount of that I think basically they are taking stock of what's happening around them to know whether or not it's time to depart. But when it comes to overall, like what they do year to year, the Alaska robins always migrate. And then basically, as you head south in latitude, further south in latitude, it becomes really variable. So you start to get these individuals that can switch between the different strategies. And so I think in terms of your question about choice, I think there's probably more of that in robins that occur at these more southern and mid latitudes, whereas the robins in the more northern places are kind of more of what they're doing is likely genetically based. So, Alaska birds, for example, are departing on their migration in September, which, that's pretty much ahead of when conditions really start to worsen in Alaska. So, there's these like various mechanisms, internal mechanisms that are happening in that bird. And, there's various cues like photoperiods, so day length, that they're using to basically time, okay, it's time to migrate. Whereas I think the robins that occur, say, in Bloomington, Indiana, are very much more paying attention to what's happening to them locally in terms of worsening temperatures, snow, and so on. And that ends up being the cue that tells them, hey, it's time to leave. And the thought is using more of those environmental cues is a sign that those individuals are more kind of making decisions on the fly, so to speak, versus, robins occurring in these more northern latitudes. They have, like these kind of internal mechanisms, genetics are at play that tell them, hey, it's time to go.
So, if a robin who is typically sort of a Canadian robin decides to make a home in Bloomington, Indiana, would it switch the cues from this more genetically based set of triggers to more environmentally based triggers?
I think it's possible, but probably unlikely. And I should say it's pretty unlikely that a robin would make such a switch like that between summering locations, kind of across the board in birds as well as a lot of animals. Site fidelity, so returning to the same locations year after year, is generally the norm. And so the opposite of that, breeding dispersal, so they breed in one area and go to a completely different area in another year, is more considered the exception. That scenario in and of itself would be pretty unlikely, but hypothetically, if it were to happen, I think that bird would still be operating on more of these kind of genetic and hormonal mechanisms that would determine whether they migrate or not.
And so, for folks who didn't listen to the previous episode, what drew you to robins? Why did you feel compelled or impassioned to study this species?
I usually have like an answer that's more of a fun answer and then more of the realistic answer. So I guess I could give both. The more fun answer, which still is a part of why I study robins, is the type of questions, the scientific questions that have always really interested me are these questions around what shapes variation in migration. So why do some individuals migrate and some don't? What shapes that decision, and why do we see variation among and within species? And robins are pretty much the perfect species to ask that question because they have so much variation in what they do. And, someone could say, oh, well, how did you even know that the variation existed before actually, tracking them to know? And you can just tell if you look at their range map, you can see that a lot of the range maps that you can find on All About Birds online or eBird, the summer location is colored in orange. The wintering range is colored in blue. And then for individuals or for species that don't migrate, it's colored in purple, and that indicates year-round range. And when you look at the range map for robins, you see all three colors. So you know that there has to be populations that definitely migrate because that orange and blue are spatially separated. But then you also can assume that there must be robins that don't migrate because there's this whole area, which is pretty much most of the lower 48, colored in purple. And so I often also tell people that a common misconception with that year-round label is all that means really at the end of the day is any time of year you could see that species in a particular location. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that species doesn't migrate. And so, for example, I often give the case with robins in the DC region. We have robins that spend their summers here and then they go further south for their winter. We have robins that literally don't migrate, so they are here year round. And then we have robins that are coming from, New Brunswick, Canada, that are spending their winter in DC. So effectively, you are seeing robins in DC year round, but the kind of composition of those robins in terms of migratory and resident is different. That's kind of the fun answer. And then the more realistic answer about why I started studying robins is before I started my PhD at Georgetown University, I was working for the National Park Service in Alaska for Denali National Park. And a couple of years into that position, a friend, mentor, and collaborator of mine, Dr. Alex John, reached out to me and said, hey, I want to start putting GPS tags on robins. And this was part of kind of a larger study that he was interested in of looking at, questions of variation and migration, but at the genus level. So robins are in the genus Turdus, and he was also studying Turdus thrushes in South America, which is, a whole other kind of can of worms in terms of migration. There's a bunch of different types of migration they do in South America. And so he was wanting to make these kind of like North temperate and South temperate comparisons between different species in the same genus. And so we started putting tags out on robins in 2017. So, we were, obviously tracking Alaska robins at the time, and Alex was putting tags out on robins in DC, and another collaborator was putting them on in Massachusetts. And so there was kind of this idea of like trying to make comparisons of robins across different locations in their range. And when I knew I got accepted at Georgetown and was going to start my PhD, that was in 2020. And initially had agreed with my PhD advisor that I was going to do a study on two different species that occur in Alaska and only in Alaska. So they're considered kind of old world species. So they spend their winters in Siberia and Asia. And they're species that their migration has never been studied before. And it's thought that what would be unusual and cool is that they head north and potentially kind of follow the Bering Strait and then head south to their wintering location. So that's kind of the anticipated migratory path that they think that these species do, but it hasn't been directly studied via putting tracking tags on these species. My PhD is going to be a migration study on these species that only occur in Alaska. But the thing is, these species also only occur in very remote places in Alaska where the only access is by plane or by boat. And, as we all know, pandemic happened in 2020. And so a lot of those kind of small village communities, access to those communities was only limited to the people who were from there and lived there. And so I was initially going to do a pilot season in 2020, and it just totally got scrapped given all of this. Initially, heading into 2021, the plan was still to try to make this work. But in 2021, travel and access to those communities was still limited to residents of the area. And kind of around this time, 2020, 2021, researchers from Max Planck Institute, led by Dr. Martin Wikelski, were launching these Icarus tags, which I can't remember if I mentioned them in the previous episode, but they've been really hyped up. They were these tags that were developed by this research institute, and the locations were being received and transmitted through an antenna that was on the International Space Station. And they had 500 tags that they reached out to my PhD advisor and said, hey, like, we have these 500 tags. We want you to put them on robins. And at the time that all of this was going on, I was still, planning on doing this project in Alaska. And Pete, my advisor, said, hey, like, do you want to kind of manage this? Because he knew that I had robin experience already, and said, do you want to basically create this huge network of researchers all across US and Canada to say, hey, are you willing to put like 5 tags out on robins? And then ideally, it would have been like 25 different sites where each researcher, was given a handful of these tags, and we put them out and have this kind of amazing continental perspective of what robins do. Unfortunately, that project, those tags unfortunately had a bunch of hiccups with them, and so that didn't work out. But effectively, this was going on at the time, and research was still being really limited by the pandemic. Travel was still being limited. And I was kind of grappling with, okay, this Alaska project is looking like it's not going to happen. And here I have this species that I don't have to get special permission travel for because they're literally in my backyard. And so kind of did this major shift to, okay, I'm going to do my PhD on robins. And so that's kind of how it realistically happened. But, it all fell into place because robins are a pretty incredible species when it comes to migration and how variable they are. So it worked out.
Well, I think I'll never look at those eBird range maps the same again. So thank you for that. A quintessential backyard bird for many people, and a quite common bird. And, I think we have a tendency as human people to discount species that are common, and that often doesn't end very well for both us and species. You were quoted in this WBEZ article about a potential decline in robin populations. Could you talk about this decline? Who noticed it and how, and what does it mean? And can we stop it before it is unstoppable?
So this reporter approached me, because I was interested, like, how did you get this idea for the article? And he said that how it all started for him is he literally saw, I think, like a cracked blue egg on the sidewalk. And was like, oh, like it's a robin's egg. And I think he just like went down a rabbit hole, was like, start Googling robins. And through his searching was like, oh, like they're not doing well in particular in Illinois, which is where, it was I think a Chicago based newspaper. And so then, yeah, he got interested in like, why are they declining here? Is there anything specifically happening in the Chicago area that is really impacting robins? And it kind of like went off from there. I think he reached out to somebody who then said, hey, you should reach out to Emily, the unofficial robin expert, which I don't claim being a robin expert by any means, but that's how I got in touch with him. And that is something that I often, when you try to get people to care about your research, a lot of the time the care starts when people find out, oh, this species is declining or this species is on the brink. And scarcity drives interest. I've often thought about this in terms of, for example, like diamond rings, right? The more rare the gem, the more costly it is. And rarity drives how special something is viewed. And so I think that's definitely the case for animals as well. Knowing that, oh, this species is not doing well, usually people immediately make the connection of, oh, it's not doing well, so we should study it. And that's often why common species are overlooked. It's like, oh, they're everywhere. Like, we don't need to do anything about them. And so I often tell people that, hey, robins have actually been on the decline for the last 30 years. And people are instantly surprised because robins are really everywhere. They're this incredibly common species. And so people just think, oh, like, they must be doing so well. Ebert has these like really amazing trend maps online where you can kind of toggle through different species and different times of the year and see, like, based on colors on the map, whether particular areas of North America that species is declining or increasing. And so if you do that for robins, there's a lot of places in North America where they're declining. I have some hunches for why some areas they might be declining. When it comes to Chicago and city environments, how I talked about this with the reporter is that, take everything I say with a grain of salt because this hasn't been studied. So we don't have the data to back it up. Like we have the patterns of decline, which we find out there's like long-term data sets like the breeding bird survey and Christmas bird count. And through those counts and abundance estimates, you can see those trends over time. Oh, robins, like 50 years ago, the overall abundance in this area was, you could say 20 robins in a mile. And now it's only 5. So you can know that there's declines happening, but what's driving the declines? You have to do like on the ground studies to study a specific population and study them for several years. And through that, you can, do these kind of fancy models to determine their survival rates. And then you can link it to things like climate, changes in climate, increasing human development, toxins in the environment, things like that. And so that hasn't been done for robins. So I say all that as kind of a caveat. But what I think might be going on is that cities might be some kind of ecological trap for robins and other species too. Cities can be seen as kind of, where the good life is because there's all these like supplemental sources of food. One, cities often get planted by like a lot of ornamental plants are planted in cities, and a lot of those different species bloom or fruit year round, or fruit and bloom in times of the year when, the native species would be like, their leaves would be gone and they basically look dead. And so there's food sources there. There's, of course, food sources via people put out bird feeders. More people, there's probably more bird feeders. And then, trash, food waste, things like that. Like there's all these different ways that, cities offer kind of more food more consistently throughout the year than, let's say, intact forest would. And the other thing that cities offer is what's called the heat island effect. And so cities generally are warmer than the surrounding area. And that's because, the buildings and concrete kind of give off this heat. There's more kind of quote unquote machines that are powered in these areas. So, like, there's just like generally overall more latent heat in cities than there are outside the city. And so, from that angle, too, when it comes to wildlife, cities can be kind of buffered from climatic extremes than, the areas outside of cities. And so, like, you can think of cities as like the food is good and the climate isn't as extreme. And I do think, and my data would back this up, that migration, quote unquote, is way less common in robins in cities than robins that are breeding outside the city. And this is also kind of another topic that's not super well studied, but there's kind of more increasing evidence to show that there's declining migration with increasing human development. And, there was a study that came out a few years ago that this species of hummingbird that occurs out west was starting to migrate less because they were relying on these hummingbird feeders that people were keeping out throughout the whole year. So back to this ecological trap question is there's all these quote unquote benefits of cities, but on the flip side, there's kind of also novel risks to wildlife in cities. So, they're probably going to encounter cars more. Collision risk, not only with cars, but buildings, is way higher in cities. There's generally, I should say, don't quote me on this, but I would predict that there's probably way more contaminants in cities than there are outside of cities. And so, wildlife can absorb those contaminants through waterways. And for robins in particular, they forage on the ground and they eat earthworms, which are in the soil. And the soil really is a place where contaminants kind of stay and can accumulate. So there's all these kind of, like negative things associated with cities. And so I wonder when it comes to robins that, especially at these kind of lower latitude cities where robins are way more flexible, the data would indicate that they are making these migratory decisions based on their local environment, the things that they're experiencing as they experience them. And so they're probably trading off, like, do I migrate this year or not? And it could be that, the trade off of the benefit of not migrating and staying in the same place is, these other risks that they're exposed to. And so while I can't say, for sure, because I haven't studied it as part of my dissertation, my hunch is that survival is probably lower for robins that don't migrate in cities. So there's like this trade-off with migration and with being in a city. So that's kind of what I said to the reporter of this article, that, why we might be seeing more declines in cities is that robins and these other species that are staying year round in these cities, they gain the benefit of not migrating because migration is energetically costly thing for birds to do, but then they could potentially experience these kind of cumulative negative effects. There's all this research on cortisol and stress response, and the energetic cost of living in cities versus not for, species that you can find in both rural and city environments, and show that, in general, like, for example, for birds, birds have to sing louder in cities because they have to basically try to reach potential mates above the din of city noise. And that costs a lot more energy. And then kind of they're just like circulating like baseline cortisol is higher in these species that occur in cities versus in rural areas. And so all of that could, accumulate to leading to lower overall survival, shorter lifespan for these species that occur in cities and also don't occur in cities. So I do think that's probably something that's happening with robins. The other thing that I can tie to research is collaborators of mine have been studying contaminants in robins, and they've been collecting blood samples, which is a good way to measure, how much like mercury might be in their blood, for example, or lead. And so my collaborators have done work on lead levels in robin blood, and it is just like way higher in cities. There's definitely lots of evidence for lead being bad for wildlife.
And bad for people. It
Yeah, bad
sounds
for people
like, you know,
across
I
the
mean,
board.
across the board. So some of the stressors that are affecting robins, extreme heat is a major killer of people, of humans in cities. Certainly, lead has a lot of deeply negative cognitive impacts, especially when children are exposed. So, in some ways, it feels like the robin, through its declining numbers, especially in this case of Chicago, perhaps might be telling us that the environment is placing us at risk.
Yeah, for sure. What I said to that reporter is that in some ways, people overlook common species. But if I see declines in common species, and to me, that's like major, much larger alarm bell, because a lot of common species also, like, there's been declines in starlings, declines in house sparrows. So non-native species, but these species also people overlook it and are like, oh, they're everywhere. But when they're showing declines, that shows like a much broader risk as well, right? Because they occur in so many different places. And if they're showing declines in multiple locations, that spells that there's just like, much broader level issues that we should be concerned about. On the flip side of that, if you see that, oh, just like this population is declining, like that points to it must be something specific to that area that is bad. But when you see common species that is declining across a lot of its range, that points to like bigger issues. So, obviously the big one is climate change, right? And so one of the things I talked about with this reporter that I definitely think comes to play with robins is in these places where they might be switching between migrating in some years and not migrating in others. One of the impacts of climate change is that, not only places are warming and becoming drier, but the predictability and frequency and intensity of extreme events. These things are way more unpredictable now. They're way more intense and they tend to be more frequent. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of these kind of like once in 50-year events, like big floods, are happening way more often now. And so when it comes to robins that are, making these decisions on the fly, so to speak, like, oh, this is the area I'm going to stay for the winter, and you get some sort of freak snowstorm, that's going to majorly impact that bird. And there's definitely events like this that have happened. I think it was in 2021 that there was this, crazy freeze that happened in Texas. You might have heard about it. Like, there was all this news about the Texas power system. The power grid is definitely defunct. And so all of these people were out of heat and power for weeks at a time. And it was, this unusual event that Texas wasn't prepared for. And, obviously that also impacted the wildlife. And so I remember seeing articles of people finding robins and other birds just like dead on the sidewalk. And they looked fine, visibly. And it was likely not that they froze to death, that they probably died of starvation. Major freeze event, that could cause wildlife to die on the spot, but also these places that don't necessarily regularly, consistently get snow, that suddenly got some crazy snow event, impacts, wildlife's ability to access food. I've seen articles where there's been these kind of extreme, unpredictable event that happened, and visibly birds were found dead and looked, visibly fine. And it was likely, a combination of either the freeze killed them and or they starved to death.
Mm.
So I think that stuff is likely happening more everywhere, but in these areas that, can kind of look good, like cities, they're going to impact those species more because, these species are staying in cities, not migrating, and can't necessarily predict these unusual extreme events that happen and then, face the consequences of staying in these places.
Emily, for folks who are interested in robins and the health of their populations, is there a place they can go to easily to find that information? Does something like this exist specifically for robins? Or are you the sort of go-to resource if folks are interested in robins?
I don't want to take credit for being the go-to resource because there are, of course, a lot of robin researchers that are across North America. But yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, I can't think of anything specific just to robins. There's a researcher, Dr. Karina Sanchez, who did her PhD on robins as well. She was doing more of a study that was looking at kind of song and vocal behavior in relation to robins that occurred in the city and robins that occurred in more rural areas, and looking at, like singing rates and how loud they sang and things like that. So kind of, harkening back to some of the research that has looked at like how do species modify their behavior when they're in cities versus not in cities. And she had some sort of website that I don't know if it's still active where people could go to it and I think report banded robins that she had banded and, learn about her project. So there's that. And the other program I can think of that isn't specific to robins, but, robins are a vocal species, is the Smithsonian Neighborhood Nest Watch program. This program goes to people's yards. So people have to opt in to it, say, hey, like you can use my yard for research. I worked off of this program. This is how I found a lot of my study sites within the DC area is by basically leveraging the sites that had already been vetted and approved through the Smithsonian Neighborhood Nest Watch program. And this program, they go and, it's kind of like an outreach, an education type of program where they engage, local residents in kind of bird science and show them like, bird banding and also how to find nests, things like that. And so that, you can also Google and find online. And I do think there's a page that's dedicated to robins. But otherwise, yeah, I think, generally if you Google American robins and migration, usually my name pops up. So
Okay.
if people are interested in migration specifically, I think it's okay to say that I would be a good resource to go to.
Okay. I will link to you in the show notes. I really want to thank you for coming back on to talk about your research and just giving us a status update on this species that is common and beautiful and sort of worthy of our attention, a really wonderful part of the urban soundscape. It's quite sad to think about the places where most people live, putting such a beautiful sort of member of the world we live in at risk. So I really appreciate you taking the time, Emily.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that about robins. And I love hearing when people come to me and say that they're so easy to overlook because they're everywhere. But when you really take some time and look at them, they are quite beautiful. They have that bright red, orangey breast. And yeah, I think that they are a beautiful bird, even if they are common.
Yeah, don't not common, right? It's like I want to see lots of birds all the time.
Agreed, agreed. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Bird Story. Like, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Your Bird Story is an initiative of Local Nature Lab.